What if the quietest man in the palace was also its most radical mind? Born into chaos in 1819, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha wasn't just Queen Victoria's husband. He was a visionary who rewired the British monarchy from the inside out. Behind the lace and formality, he was a restless architect of change, champion of photography, urban planning, humane labor laws, and modern science. This isn't a tale of royal pageantry. It's the real story of a boy shaped by abandonment, who built systems to survive it and reshaped an empire along the way. From his passionate marriage to Victoria, through court scandals, parenting struggles, and the world-changing triumph of the Great Exhibition, Albert became the beating heart of a monarchy that didn't quite know what to do with him, until it was too late. This documentary dives deep into his triumphs, heartbreaks, and legacy. If you think you know Victorian history, think again. This is the untold story of the prince who modernized a kingdom, one blueprint, one law, and one heartbreak at a time. If you rewind the reel to the first cry of August 26, 1819, the screen flares into noise. Cannon salutes, a lace-capped nurse fainting in the heat, and two feuding parents who could not have synchronized a lullaby if their lives depended on it. Duke Ernest III of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha stalked the corridors in polished cavalry boots, smelling of pomade and last night's champagne, while his wife, Princess Louise, drifted behind Chinese silk screens with poets who recited sonnets until dawn. They named their second son, Francis Albert Augustus Charles Emmanuel, a name so long it seemed designed to distract outsiders from the screams echoing through the Schloss. By the time Albert could toddle, he was dodging slammed doors and whispering gossip, learning that love might vanish in a carriage before breakfast. The lesson burrowed deep. Stability would be his life's grail, and he would seize it, even if the rest of the world mistook his grip for coldness. The brothers Ernest and Albert were bundled off to their grandmother's estate in the Thuringian forest, where pine trunks rose like gray cathedral columns, and tutors arrived in a perpetual shuffle of Latin declensions, violins, and moral maxims. Albert turned out to be the kind of child who copied Euclid proofs for fun, and then rode a half-broke pony through nettles just to feel the sting. At night, he penned bleak little fables about princes banished for their parents' sins. He was, the court chaplain said, too solemn by half, but solemnity felt safer than chaos. When word arrived that his mother had been officially divorced and exiled to a castle 200 miles away, and that she wept for her sons but dared not contact them, Albert took the news without a tear. Instead, he catalogued the betrayal, filed it beneath lessons learned, and fenced until his shoulders ached. In 1836, lanky and sharp featured at 17, Albert followed his brother to Bonn University. If Coburg had been claustrophobic, Bonn was a revelation. Philosophy lectures that spiraled into midnight debates, beer halls roaring with Schubert Lieder, dueling societies whose sabers stitched bright clots of blood across young men's foreheads like badges of existential courage. Albert fenced too. He won the Silver Oak Leaf Medal, but what truly electrified him was knowledge expanding at steam engine speed. He studied Kant, Hegel, astronomy, acoustics, constitutional law. He sketched cloister arches on weekend rambles down the Rhine and filled copybooks with schemes for humane housing, universal education, and public sanitation. His friends teased that he would reform Germany by tea time and redesign the national railway by supper, but he only smiled an austere smile and sharpened his pencils. Work, he had decided, was the only antidote to emotional vertigo. Enter Uncle Leopold, monarch of a brand new Belgium carved from the bones of Napoleon's map. Leopold, keen to stabilize Europe one dynastic match at a time, scanned his family tree and spotted a tidy solution to Britain's looming succession drama. Princess Victoria of Kent, about to turn 18, pocket-sized, whip-smart, famously stubborn, needed a husband who would neither overshadow her crown nor embarrass it. Albert, trim, cultured, devout, and connected by blood through Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, looked custom-built. So, in May 1836, the Coburg brothers visited Kensington Palace, ostensibly for the royal birthday party. Victoria, still technically under the thumb of her mother, and the loathed Sir John Conroy, peeked around a marble pillar and saw Albert leaning against a balustrade, eyes the color of forget-me-nots after rain. He bowed. She blushed. The court diaries recorded a spark, though Victoria, wary of puppeteers, scribbled later that she would decide when and if the spark became a flame. 2 years passed. Albert toured Italy, scribbling critiques of Tuscan frescoes and learning enough art history to lecture his future children. He sat for a portrait with Peter von Cornelius, trekked over the Alps, and sent Victoria watercolors of snow-smothered valleys. By the time he returned to England in October 1839, she had been queen for 27 tumultuous months, had booted Conroy from her rooms, and was aching for compatriot-level companionship. The morning Albert arrived at Windsor, he wore a simple blue frock coat. Victoria, usually a model of composure at public audiences, later recalled that her heart beat so violently one might see it through my bodice. Protocol forbade a man from proposing to a reigning queen. So after tea, Victoria dismissed her ladies, summoned Albert to the saloon, paced once like a caged linnet, then announced, in what Albert remembered as a sweet and trembling voice, that she wished to share her crown with him. He accepted, kissed her hand, and promptly sat down because his knees felt insubstantial as parchment. Their wedding exploded the London winter gloom. On February 10th, 1840, the crowds jammed Trafalgar Square 10 deep, sleet spitting onto bonnets and stovepipes, as the royal couple's carriage rocked past cheering lines of factory workers who had wagered lunch wages on whether the new prince would smile. He did, briefly, but what delighted him more was the chapel music. Handel's "Let Thy Hand Be Strengthened," its counterpoint rising like scaffolding he could inhabit. He squeezed Victoria's glove during the vows, a tiny private punctuation, and she looked up with eyes shimmering brighter than the candles. That night in Buckingham Palace, she tore off her orange blossom wreath and wrote, as candid as any diarist who has ever been incandescently in love, that physical bliss was a heavenly comfort she could never have imagined. In the glow of a single candelabrum, Albert promised her she would never, ever be alone again. Yet the morning after, passion came politics. Parliament haggled over his allowance. The anti-German press accused him of being a penniless interloper destined to flood Whitehall with foreign cousins. He could not, by law, hold official offices or even assume the title of king consort, so he reinvented himself as the engineer behind the throne. He rose at 5, plunged his face into ice water, then devoured dispatch boxes, army budgets, canal surveys, draft treaties willy-nilly upstairs. When ministers arrived for their weekly audiences with the Queen, they found Albert already cross-referencing footnotes. Some bristled, others, relieved to meet a royal who understood compound interest, upgraded him from nuisance to secret weapon. At Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, bought partly to escape the London smog that aggravated his neuralgia, Albert sketched plans for terraces, porticos, even the drainage. He liaised with Thomas Cubitt, argued for what we would now call passive cooling, and personally selected white and ochre plaster so the villa would glow like a piece of toasted almond in Mediterranean light. Across the Solent at Portsmouth, naval architects grumbled that a prince was lecturing them on dry dock gradients, yet discovered his suggestions saved money and mildew in equal measure. In Scotland, when he and Victoria bought Balmoral, Albert immersed himself in Highland laird culture, hunting stags at dawn, but also commissioning a new water supply for the local village. He adored bagpipes at 5 a.m., to Victoria's mild horror, and experimented with tartan designs that later set every Victorian middle-class parlor a-quaver with plaid mania. Childbirth became the drumbeat behind his architectural overtures. Victoria produced 9 babies between 1840 and 1857. Albert attended each delivery, mopping her brow, offering chloroform once it became medically acceptable, and timing contractions with the same meticulousness he applied to railroad schedules. He loved each infant fiercely yet intellectually, as though he could sculpt character with a syllabus. Vicky, clever and witty, read Plato in German by 12. Alice absorbed her father's earnest charity and would nurse wounded soldiers during the Austro-Prussian War. Alfred learned naval strategy at breakfast. Helena embroidered, Louise sculpted, Arthur idolized all things military. Leopold inherited both his father's gentle logic and a lethal blood disorder. And Beatrice, born after Albert's health had begun its slow unthreading, became her mother's emotional prosthesis. Albert believed the nursery was Britain in microcosm. Teach these 9 souls duty, thrift, and curiosity, and you seed an empire of progress. He hired tutors to drill them in metallurgy 1 hour, sketch wildflowers the next, and compose 8-bar piano melodies as homework. When Birdie lagged, he preferred practical jokes to conjugating Latin gerunds. Albert's frustration cracked into severity. The flogging incident, whispered in palace corridors, horrified the Archbishop of Canterbury, but earned nods from stern Victorians who quoted proverbs about sparing rods. Albert agonized afterward, penning regretful lines in his diary about the terrible burden of molding clay that resists the potter. Yet the next day, he was up before dawn, drafting a memorandum on model farm management, because guilt could not be allowed to rust productive hours. The model farm at Windsor was another dream-made brick. Albert imported Dutch cattle, tested fertilizers, and introduced drainage tiles that tripled hay yields. He invited skeptical landlords to inspect steam threshers and left them muttering, "Maybe the German has a point." He prodded Parliament to reform child labor, pressed for the abolition of slavery across the empire's lingering outposts, and served as president of the Society for the Improvement of the Condition of the Laboring Classes. At a time when many aristocrats treated railways as smoke-belching monstrosities, Albert relished their mathematical regularity. He invested personal funds in the Great Western, wrote pamphlets about standardized gauge, and once crawled beneath a locomotive to examine a burst cylinder rod while startled engineers gawked at the prince flat on his back in soot. Photography fascinated him even more. He purchased a daguerreotype apparatus in 1842 and by 1848 had converted a palace room into a chemical darkroom, leaving silver nitrate stains on mahogany tables that horrified the housekeeper. The first photograph of a royal family group, Victoria in white silk, Albert holding baby Arthur, was his idea, not hers, and it circulated across Europe on cartes de visite that turned monarchy into accessible theater. He foresaw the democratic power of the image long before newspapers abandoned wood engravings. Every flash of magnesium powder heralded a modernity he believed must be embraced lest Britain fossilize. All this industry funneled toward 1851. The Great Exhibition was Albert's Everest. He chaired the Royal Commission with the patience of a chess grandmaster and the fury of a deadline-besieged editor. He recruited Joseph Paxton, Gardner architect, whose design for a vast iron and glass hall drew inspiration from lily leaves, coaxed skeptical MPs with promises of cultural prestige, reassured Tory landowners that the building would be temporary. It wasn't, and batted away tabloid jibes calling it the Prince's Folly. On opening day, he stood on a dais beside Victoria. The organ thundered, "God save the Queen!" and 25,000 people surged inside to wander aisles of Colt revolvers, Indian silks, Russian furs, and a calculating machine by Charles Babbage that foreshadowed Silicon futures. When a Chartist delegation presented Albert with a steel pen for the People's Prince, he bowed so low his top hat nearly grazed the parquet. They had grasped what the snobs missed. His exhibition was a sermon about peaceful competition beating battlefield carnage. The profit, £186,000, became seed money for museums, a polytechnic, the Royal Albert Hall, and the Royal College of Music, an ecosystem of learning that rebranded muddy South Kensington as Albertopolis. Albert strolled the site wearing a battered felt hat, supervising foundation trenches, gossiping with plasterers in unaccented English, so refined that only the sharpest ear caught the German consonants. He insisted that ticket prices for the museums be kept low enough that an artisan might nourish his imagination on a Sunday afternoon. To future generations he would be the statue glinting atop the gilded memorial, but in those moments he was simply the man measuring window mullions with a carpenter's rule borrowed from a bemused foreman. Meanwhile, Europe seethed. The 1848 revolutions had toppled thrones like chess pieces. Russian expansion menaced the Ottoman Empire, and in America, civil war clouds thickened. Albert, who read diplomatic telegrams before breakfast, considered peace not just moral duty, but economic rationality. During the Trent Affair of 1861, when a U.S. Navy captain seized Confederate envoys off a British mail steamer, Whitehall hawks demanded retaliation. Lord Palmerston drafted an ultimatum that might have plunged Britain into the American Civil War. Albert, feverish and aching but still mentally ferocious, rewrote the dispatch in gentler language, softening ultimatums into requests for explanation. Lincoln's cabinet, given face-saving room, released the envoys. Few of his countrymen realized that a man they could not legally call king had perhaps averted transatlantic catastrophe. Yet Albert's own body was rebelling. The stomach spasms that began as mere nuisance after the 1859 Italian crisis grew into nightly tortures. Doctors prescribed horseback exercise and bismuth. He complied and vomited. Victoria fretted, tucked hot bricks at his feet, scolded him for working through chills, and then, pregnant again, retreated into her own hormonal storms. Albert, mindful of Hanoverian madness rumored in Victoria's bloodline, kept watch over her emotional weather, noting with clinical detachment when she drifted toward melancholy. He wrote her affectionate notes, "My dearest angel, do not overtax thy heart," but barred her from council papers once her temper spiked, terrified a rash comment might leak to the press. The Birdie Dilemma reached boiling point precisely when Albert's constitution was least able to withstand shock. The sleet-drenched march at Cambridge soaked him to the skin. The confrontation felt like reliving his father's humiliations, but this time with the fate of an empire attached. Back at Windsor, he warmed himself by the fire, yet shivered uncontrollably. The physicians muttered typhoid because it fit the fever chart, but the court rumor mill whispered remorse. On December 5th, he was carried to bed in the Blue Room under a ceiling fresco of Aurora scattering roses. Ironic, because Albert could now bear neither dawn nor fragrance. 7 days later, he begged Victoria to open the window shutters so he could glimpse the fir trees. She wept because the winter wind might kill him. He smiled faintly and said, "Ich komme. I am coming." After his death, royal protocol took over like a machine. The funeral date was fixed, mourning stationery embossed, court servants stitched black crepe over the velvet cushions of every carriage. But beneath the choreography, Victoria unraveled. She had always called him her lord and master, yet paradoxically found in him the permission to reign. Without that counterweight, she felt not freed, but untethered. She banned music at court for a year, spoke to ministers through a half-closed door, and wrote Dear Birdie in her diary when she meant Albert, an erasure that would bruise her eldest son each time he stumbled upon it. She kept glands of lavender in drawers with Albert's handkerchiefs so she could inhale him at dusk when the corridors creaked. She left orders that the gas lamps in the corridor leading to the blue room burn all night, lest he lose his way returning. Birdie endured penance that would have unnerved a medieval monk. His letters to friends drip with appeals for basic responsibilities. Could he represent the crown at a Paris exhibition? No. His mother thought the French air unhealthy. Could he review a regiment? Only if he stood behind the colonel, invisible to reporters. He escaped in baccarat, in mistresses, in yachting trips to the Mediterranean where he lounged on deck reading Zola and coughing cigar smoke into constellations his father once named for him. Historians like to ask when the Edwardian age truly began. One could argue it began the instant Birdie realized the only way to survive was to invent a persona so dazzling, top hats, garden parties, coronation grandeur, that no one would notice the raw, silent wound inside. The other children orbited differently. Princess Alice, practical and tender, wrote piles of consoling letters to her mother, then saw her own marriage to Louis of Hesse overshadowed by Victoria's fear of abandonment. Alfred, second son, sailed the world and tried to carve an identity in Gunsmoke and Pacific Salt. Louise, restless artist, fought for permission to attend art school and sculpted a marble portrait of her father that captured the slight forward tilt of his thoughtful head. Arthur became a field marshal. Leopold, bleeding fragile, became a pioneer patron of hemophilia research before dying after a simple fall in Cannes. Beatrice, the last, served as her mother's translator, secretary, emotional lightning rod, and duly married the only man willing to move into a palace where every clock still ticked in memory-paced time. And Albert? The world kept reinterpreting him. Victorians elevated him into a paragon of domestic virtue, a sepia patriarch gazing sternly from biscuit tins. Edwardians, hungry for sparkle, sidelined him as the dull foil to their party king. Mid-20th century scholars, allergic to sentiment, painted him a control freak who micromanaged a queen and bullied a son. The 21st century lens, mercifully more nuanced, sees a traumatized boy who built systems to outwit chaos, a visionary who understood that steam engines, education acts, and photography would matter long after court gossip rotted. His correspondence with engineers on iron truss tolerances sits today in the Science Museum, alongside his sketch of a humane abattoir. His marginalia on drafts of the 1844 Factory Act reveal the precise moment he argued that girls under 18 should not work night shifts. His doodles on Blue Room stationery show telegraph poles strung across imagined continents. We've reached the end for today. Be sure to click the like button, share your thoughts below, and subscribe to our channel for more exciting content. Thanks for tuning in.